Today I want to talk to you about how investors evaluate the video game industry, or more specifically, what investors evaluate. And I'm going to start with a reference, if you'll forgive me, to American baseball. I know many of you flew here from a very long distance. I'm sure you didn't think you were going to be hearing a lecture about American baseball from a CEO of a Tokyo-based game company, but I'm going to do that anyway for a minute. Whether or not you're a fan of baseball, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with the book and movie Moneyball. I hope so, because it was a really interesting story about the 2002 Oakland A's and its manager, Billy Beane. And to jog your memory, and for those of you who haven't seen or read the book, Beane revolutionized sports by challenging the way the experts, or what was considered the experts of the day, evaluated players and team performance. And in the process, he managed to infuriate most of baseball by hiring a statistician to manage his team roster. And he confirmed the thesis through that process that was held by a small group of baseball nerds that most of baseball, and especially the talent scouts, were dead wrong in the metrics that they were using to evaluate players. And to make a long story short, poor performers were being drafted and then wildly overpaid because they looked good and because they did things like making home runs or lots of RBIs, runs batted in. And on the other end of the spectrum, there were players with very high percentages of getting on base, which were ignored and massively underpaid because nobody had made the connection between getting on base and winning games. These guys who got on base consistently, they oftentimes didn't look like the great baseball players. They were overweight, or they were slow, or they swung the bat funny. But because and also because they hit singles or they walked rather than getting home runs. So this way of thinking was really contrarian, and it was a logic-based approach that disrupted about 100 years of baseball orthodoxy. But it took the A's from last place in the American League West to the American League West champions that year, even though they had the second lowest payroll in Major League Baseball that year. So I'm originally from San Francisco, and Oakland is just across the bay. And I remember that team, and then I remember what a revolution the book Moneyball was. We all read it at my previous company and all over the business world and the investing world. And people started spending a lot of time thinking about how they apply these models. So my question today is this. If you know the story of Billy Beane and Moneyball, when you're talking about the video game industry, which is what I came to talk to you about today, is the best move to invest in companies that are focused on the equivalent of hiring people who hit home runs? And if so, if it is or if it's not, how do you explain the other companies that consistently outperform much of the industry using a very, very different methodology? So put another way, how do you really know how game companies get successful? Or is there a different way to analyze them, one that will enable you to predict success before they show you results? And today I want to walk you through this line of thinking quickly about how the world evaluates the performance of video games and the companies that publish them. And I'm not Billy Beane and I'm not Paul DePodesta, but I want to invite you to examine a different way about the industry and whether we're looking at the right things. If I do nothing else today, I want you to leave here wondering if you should stop fixating on the equivalent of a good-looking, well-spoken player who can hit a home run 5% of the time and strike out the rest, and pay more attention to the equivalent of the slightly strange-looking guy who regularly gets on base. Okay, quickly on my background. I've been a gamer all my life. Like a lot of kids who grew up in my generation, we played a lot of games in arcade. My first job in high school was to sell games on an Apple II, if any of you remember what that was. I'm seeing some smiles around the audience here. We're all a little older. But I still play games pretty much every day on mobile, but also a lot on PC and a lot on console. And I've now been in the industry for almost 2 decades. I spent just about a decade at Electronic Arts, and I found and drove the acquisitions during that period of time, including some companies like DICE, which is now pretty much the backbone of their company. And during that time, Nexon, the company that I am now CEO of, was at the top of my list for M&A for the entire 9 years. I made 3 formal attempts to buy the company. I was rebuffed each time, and they kept inviting me to come over and join the company, and I kept saying no. And long story short, after about 9 years, I lost, and I decided, or won, and came over to Nexon. So I've spent most of my career analyzing game companies. And I've noticed that the industry and the analysts that watch it have a widely established orthodoxy when it comes to analyzing and investing in the industry. And I want to talk about that. This orthodoxy is reflected in the types of questions my IR team gets asked frequently. And I've listed out these questions on the left-hand side here. Our IR team, and by the way, it just happened again today, this morning, we had a couple of investor meetings. We'll get asked questions like, when does product X decline? In Nexon's case, it's usually Dungeon Fighter and MapleStory. They'll ask us when that product declines. Or they'll say, one of your mobile products has risen 5 slots in the App Store. What's up with that? And the questions on the right are the types of questions that we ask inside the industry when we're looking at other companies, either in the context of M&A or just game developers and game operators talking to each other about how their games are doing to try to figure out whether that company is going to do well or not. And the types of questions we'll ask are, what's your retention rate on product X? You know, how long are you keeping your people? Or what's your content plan like? How much content do you have? Now, you could argue that the ones on the left are surface-level questions and the ones on the right are much deeper-level questions. I don't think that's the case. I think all the people that we're talking about here are highly intelligent. They're trying to look as deeply as they can. I think what's really going on is that there's something fundamental, and that fundamental difference is that the two groups have vastly different mental models of what causes success in video games. I've noticed that public equity investors have had a hard time predicting which companies are going to break out before it happens. And if they focused more on the valuable questions, they'd be much more successful in finding companies that the crowd is mostly ignoring. But to ask those types of questions, you need they need to change their mental models to ones that more accurately represent how games really work and how money is really made in the games industry. Now, the good news is there's really only 4 big ones that matter. So there's not that many, and they're actually not conceptually very difficult to understand. So in the remainder of the time, I'm going to walk you briefly through these 4 so that you have what we have. Okay, the first is product life cycle. You're going to be hearing about this in some form or another. You're going to be hearing this term a lot more in the next year, would be my prediction. Because a couple of the large Western publishers have discovered what a powerful idea it is and have started to really study how to do it well. So what do I mean by this? Excuse me. The red line is the typical perception of a product life cycle in the video games industry. It's very simple. A game goes up and a game goes down. And then in the old days, we used to call it catalog. It would go into catalog, meaning much lower prices and sort of a long, slow death. It's probably the most fundamental assumption of outsiders about online games. It's probably a mental model that you might have, whether you know it or not, in your mind. Now, it's a mental model because it's true in a vast number of cases, especially in offline games, meaning typically console or box PC games, and especially in mobile, and especially since Facebook happened about 7 or 8 years ago. Now, there's a couple of big problems with this. First, it's not true for all games. And the exceptions are huge. Second, to a person who accepts this model as gospel, there's only one question. And the question is, when is the beginning of the end? That's why they ask us this question so often in relation to our biggest titles. Any decline spells doom because you've got this mental model in your head. There's a third analytical problem, and it's also a big one. You spend too much time thinking about how a product launches as a judge of its future value, now not how long it's going to last. But a healthy online game on any platform will start small and then grow up for a long period of time. A game may not even get you excited for the first several quarters or even a year or two. Now, I've drawn this as a straight line. These types of game, it'll often fluctuate around this straight line. It'll go up and down a little bit, and that can throw people off as well. But the general trend is on this line, on this green line here. Now, these are the types of games that Nexon makes. This line is descriptive of MapleStory and Dungeon Fighter and FIFA Online and other games, and I'll describe those in a little later. And more recently, Dominations on mobile, as well as several non-Nexon games. We're not the only company that does this. We're probably the best example of a company that does this, but we're not the only one that does this. So some implications that are relevant for you as investors. First, we don't get too excited early on. We also don't get too worried as a game launches early on. And an example that happened just in the last few weeks, we launched a game called Dynasty Warriors around Asia. It's launched very, very nicely. And when I talk to my team about this, and I say, hey, nice work, guys. It looks like we've got a great game on our hands. They sort of shrug, and they say, well, why don't we talk in a quarter or two? And that's very common in our business. The second and very important one is that there's a lot of bad M&A and a lot of bad stock prices based off of a misunderstanding this mental model. People get too excited about a game near term and forget that the way that money is really made in multiplayer games is over the long term. And I'll give you a couple of examples. First, it was very clear to anybody who saw the early numbers for League of Legends, which is one of the monster hits in our industry. It was very clear that this was something really special. It had phenomenal, consistent growth. But at that time, remember this was, what, 2009? Most of the industry was completely ignoring this game. And everybody wanted to talk about Facebook games. Because everybody knew that Facebook was the future of games. I say "new" in air quotations here. But we all know how that turned out. You could tell exactly the same thing about Minecraft. If you're familiar with the game Minecraft, if you have kids that are in grade school, there's probably about a 40 to 50% chance that they've played many hours of it. And if you played it early on, you could see it, and if you saw the numbers early on, it was very obvious. Now, as a side note, well, first, neither game exploded on the scene, but they ended up being big monster hits over time. This is very important. So these are great examples of that green line there. As a side note, by the way, we tried to buy League of Legends and the developer that made it about a year before our IPO. This was in late 2010, but we ran out of money because it was before the IPO, and we got outbid by Tencent, who we have a lot of respect for. So in M&A, we ask a lot of questions about what the company is doing to sustain and grow its game over time, not whether it's currently considered a hit. And to give you a sense for what it takes to avoid that red line that I described in the last slide, I've listed a few categories, and I won't go deep into it here because we could spend all day talking about it, but a few categories of things you need to do well. So things like content updates. You need to be relentless about content updates, like characters, classes, maps. A really experienced online game company will spend between 50 and 70% of its development investments in live game updates. Think about that. Most game companies that you're familiar with spend almost nothing on live game updates, but a great online game developer, the kinds that I've been talking about, will spend 50 to 70% of their money on that. And they're also going to plan their content updates more than a year out. The next is tuning and balancing between characters in a virtual world. So if you make a character too overpowered, it's going to wreck the balance with all the other characters in the game. So you have to be very careful on that. But if you get the tuning right, it can make the game really work well. So we ask a lot of questions about that. Another great example is, remember, a live online virtual world with tens of thousands of players in the same game world at the same time. It's going to have an economy. You're going to be getting in-game gold and so on. So when you have an economy, you have a money supply. You have to think like a central banker when you've got a money supply. And actually, some of the companies in my industry employ PhD-level economists in order to make sure that they get the money supply right, the money supply issues right. It's actually a real problem, because if you get it wrong and you have inflation, then people will flow out of the game. And I could, again, talk about this for a long time, but a key point of this is that for the most part, Korean game companies lead the world in this area because they've been doing it for so much longer, and there are serious benefits to experience. Okay, let's dig a level deeper because this is an important topic. The topic of product lifecycle leads immediately to a very important question, which is what keeps a player coming back to a game? If you can figure that out, you can start to predict whether a game is going to do well long before it shows up in the revenue line. And this is a very powerful tool for an investor. But to figure that out, you've got to know what a game really is. And people get this mixed up inside and outside the games industry all the time. Now at Nexon, we look at a lot of game pitches, and one of the first things I look for is gameplay, or the mechanic that'll make this title engage me. But that's not what happens in most game pitches in our industry. Most game presentations look like Hollywood pitches, like we're delivering a linear story. It'll show the whole story from beginning to end, or the whole game. Now, in the movie industry, you need to remember that the viewer has no involvement in the process of storytelling. The viewer only passively watches the movie that's already been made. But as an investor in games, you need to know that we're not in the movie business. We're not making a movie. We make interactive experiences that are going to challenge the player and require them to make decisions and then work with others. That's why we call it interactive entertainment. This premise is very important for understanding where success comes from in the games industry. The more interactive it is, the cooler it is. So if you're not a video gamer and you want to figure out a way to think about this, think about other games that you may have played, like chess or tennis, or if you grew up in the US like I did, we used to play Capture the Flag at summer camp. You know, these are all systems, and they have rules. And these rules require you to make decisions. And then from those decisions, that's how the story emerges. Okay, it turns out that there's a branch of psychology called flow, you may have read a book by that name, where they studied happiness in a wide variety of professions. So they study artists, they study mountain climbers, and surfers, and factory workers, and even prisoners of war. And they're trying to figure out when people are happy and how they get there. What they find is that in these incredibly diverse circumstances, people can lose themselves in what they're doing. They call it flow, and when people achieve this state of flow, they report that they're at their happiest. And the best game makers know how to hack this concept of flow. And the ones that do it well can keep people in a game for a very long period of time. And they do it so well that they can literally make you happy through this concept of flow. So you want to keep doing it for a long period of time. You want to keep playing the game, just as mountain climbers will, or people who are really involved in their work or in their music will. So there's some core principles, and I'll name them very quickly. A flow state usually has some key characteristics that I've listed up here. One is meaningful work. You have to find the work that you're doing is relevant to you as a person. Second is you have to have clear goals. You need to know what you're doing. Third is immediate feedback about whether you're meeting those goals or not. It helps to have cooperation. It makes the flow experience a lot more likely. So team sports are oftentimes turned into flow experiences. And then finally, challenge tuned to ability. So that's about any other type of scenario. I've now listed up one of our most frenetic, hardcore action first-person shooter games that's upcoming called Lawbreakers, and I'm going to illustrate a little bit about what we mean here if I can get the video teamed up right. First is, let me just go through this list and talk about meaningful work. This is a sci-fi first-person shooter, and the backstory really quickly is that there's been a break in the space-time continuum, and gravity has been broken. So now gravity becomes an environmental effect. And if you ever saw, did anybody see the movie Inception? Remember that there's the fight scene in the hallway and there's no gravity? So it's somewhat like that. Now you find yourself and you're running, and then all of a sudden the gravity goes away and you're now fighting in 3D. That's the idea. You can also use gravity as a weapon, so you can drop a gravity bomb, and then pretty soon everybody starts floating around, and you're fighting in this 3D cube of death. As you can tell, I'm pretty excited about this game. I'm hoping it's going to come out soon. But for people like me who like sci-fi and like first-person shooters, this is really cool. So we've clicked off the box on meaningful work. Okay, then there's clear goals. And to describe something that is often done in first-person shooters, oh, okay, double kill there. So we've got a reticle here. Hold on, this guy's about to die. So when you shoot someone, you can see very clearly, it'll tell you at the beginning of the round what your goal is. These guys here are trying to take a key item and preventing the other team from doing the same. You get told your mission at the beginning of the round, and you see your score at the top about you versus the other, about the bad, versus the bad guys. And then you get immediate feedback. So as they're shooting, I'm not sure if you can see this, but you can see the health of the people over here and how their health is. You can see where you shot them in the leg versus the arm. So if you're really good, you're going to keep shooting in the leg rather than shoot them all over. Meantime, you're going to get clear feedback on how you're doing. So right back there, there's some blood splattering. That's you, not them. So all through this very fast-paced action game, you're getting immediate feedback on how you're doing. As far as cooperation goes, this is a team versus team match. So it's very important you have situational awareness on where your teammates are. And then finally, challenge tuned to ability. In the case of this game, we're very careful about matchmaking. So I'm not a professional esports player. So if I get matched up with a professional esports first-person shooter arena fan who's been that way since age 17, I'm going to have a very unhappy time because I'll be the guy who cowers in the corner trying to avoid getting shot at virtually. So what they do is they make sure to matchmake correctly between gamers. Now this last one is very important. And the key word here is tuned. To vastly oversimplify, we look at whether a game is tuned to be easy to learn, hard to master, relative to its target audience. The best game makers are very good at doing this, and it's very hard to do well, especially in online games. Remember, the game maker is not writing a story. This is not movies here, okay? So they're throwing up challenges to a user, and they're setting up a system where players challenge each other. And if the challenges the user get is too hard, they're going to get frustrated. They're going to be in this frustration zone, and they're going to quit. Or if it's too easy, they're going to get bored and quit. So again, going back to matchmaking, if a really good player gets matched with a bunch of newbies like me, that player is not going to want to keep playing the game, and vice versa. But if you tune it right, your players are going to stay for a very long time. In many cases, and in certain genres, actually indefinitely. And according to psychology, flow is literally what makes us happy. So of course we never want to leave the game. And I and every other gamer who plays a lot of video games has experienced this. And this is what makes games such a wonderful art form. It's a great art form, but it's also a great entertainment, mass entertainment form. Okay, so you came here to talk not about art, but about investing. So what does this have to do with investing? What this has to do with investing is you can look at a game and you can touch it. It's tangible. People say about our industry all the time it's a hits-driven business, which is a euphemism for I don't know. It's like a gift from heaven, whether it's whether it's going to be a hit or not. But you can figure out whether a game is going to do well just by playing it. And if you're not a gamer yourself, you can talk to gamers. They're online, and they'll tell you what they think. They're probably the most vocal group of people that I know, even for online, except for maybe Instagram users. But you can go to Twitch, and you can chat with people. You can go to YouTube. You can go to the forums, and you can see what's going on. And as an example of this, if you're familiar with a colleague company in our industry, Activision, they own a developer called Blizzard. Blizzard, a couple years ago, put out a game called Hearthstone, which some of you might have played. You could tell Hearthstone 2 years ago was going to be a great game. I mean, if you just got your hands on it and started playing it, it was obviously another great game from Blizzard. The tuning was really well done, and it was really fun. And 2 years later, it continues to do really well. By the way, this also relates to monetization. Monetization in the free-to-play games world is very important. You see game companies get this wrong all the time, particularly the ex-Facebook companies. They'll over-monetize a game, meaning if you want to progress in the game, you want to go up that diagonal line, you're going to have to start paying. And if you make people do that too much, they're going to get frustrated. So we watch this tuning aspect of gameplay very closely when we're evaluating a game company, and we do it at the game level. We play the game to see how hard it is to start. We ask whether the goals are clear. Do I know what I'm supposed to be doing? Am I getting bored because the game is too easy? Is it too hard? Those sorts of questions. Okay, if you have a game that's tuned really well, it's going to often, not always, but it's going to often keep a user for a very long time. That leads to our third mental model, which is about how you spend your money to acquire new users. And this mental model is called the retention funnel. Here's a question for you. When should you invest your marketing dollars to acquire a new user for your game? Think about that for a second. Okay. The obvious answer, the simple answer, is only when you will retain them for long enough, more than long enough to get your money back, net of all the costs of acquiring them or building and maintaining the game. You should not pay up to acquire new users if they're going to stay for a very short period of time, since you'll never make your money back. Seems obvious to everybody? Okay, well, as obvious as this may seem to a room full of ROI-driven fund managers and analysts, making this mistake is exactly what most of my industry has done for the last 5 years. Why? Because they want to drive the game up the App Store charts. There's a lot of trackers of the App Stores on Apple and Google. This has been a real problem on mobile. And everybody looks at the App Store charts. Everybody inside the industry, all the investors, and they watch this really close. A lot of these companies are pre-public, they're venture-backed, and revenue growth is something that everybody watches. So they watch App Store charts as a proxy for revenue growth on the assumption that they'll be able to get to profitability, but they don't. Putting money into a very leaky bucket isn't going to help you. Game companies live or die over time based off of retained users. So what does this mean for you, the investor? It means that the App Store charts are often, if not most of the time, they're going to mislead you. So if you track them closely, watch out. You're in dangerous territory. And yet, often the questions we get from investors are about growth of a new game, as I mentioned before, or they ask about App Store rankings. They're very natural questions and understandable that we would get these questions because that's the data that we have available and that's what's commonly looked at in the industry. There's no criticism of that. My warning, though, is that it'll lead you astray. It could very easily lead you to a false understanding of a company's health. And another thing to watch out for is that these numbers and the rankings can get gamed hugely by a game company. I could drop $10 million into a game's marketing, UA, tomorrow. It would drive the game up the App Store charts. Everybody who's looking at that would say, holy smokes, these guys are onto something, and it would have an effect on our business. It would have an effect probably on our valuation. And this is very easy for a company to do. We don't do it for obvious reasons, but it happens. And so you can get led astray, and it's something to be watched out for. The company with rising revenues and high rankings on the App Store might have a much less healthy business than the lower ranked company that is retaining its users. So when we look at a company that's climbing the charts, we start asking a lot of very detailed questions. What's the average retention of a newly acquired user? And sometimes we'll want to break down that by cohorts, if they'll share it with us. We ask, a standard question is, what's your eCPI versus LTV? eCPI is your effective cost per install, and your LTV is how much you expect to make over the lifetime of an average user. LTV, by the way, is oftentimes defined in very different ways, so we'll go into what their definition of LTV is. And that's a whole other can of worms. We'll be asking if what they've been doing to acquire users outside of featuring on Apple and Google. Because what happens is if you get featured, if Apple likes your game, they'll feature it on the top spot on the App Store, and then it'll drive up your user base really quickly, and then it'll drop quickly once the featuring is over, but sometimes it'll grow very nicely based off of a good retention funnel. So we'll look closely into that. So none of these by themselves can give you the whole story, but what we're trying to build is a broad picture in our minds about what this retention bucket looks like. Okay, here's my last one. Let's talk about development of new games. The question is, how do you analyze a new game that the company is bringing to market to determine if it's going to do well in the future? How's my time, Hanjin? I'll be pretty quick. Let's play a game here. If I can ask for a show of hands, who in this room plays video games, and just to make it simple, on console or PC? Raise your hand. Okay, great. Sir, in the front row. What's your favorite game of all time? What's that? FIFA. Okay. I saw another one over here, the front row. I'm choosing the front row because that's what I can see. Yes? Age of Empires. OK. My trick worked. This is my magic trick for the day. Let's map these on a graph. And I'm going to, for those of you who hate the word fun as descriptive of a game, because a lot of games are not fun, but they are very entertaining, just bear with me for a second. We get in this debate all the time in my company. I would argue that those two games that you mentioned when they first launched were both incredibly fun to play and incredibly different from what was available at that time. And I've played both those games a lot. They're terrific games. And if you graph the big hits, the sustainable hits the last 20 years of the game industry, they're all, at least to my knowledge, all in the upper right-hand corner. They're significantly different from what came before, and they're really fun to play. They're so fun to play that you are going to bore your friends to tears telling them about your experience playing Minecraft yesterday or Grand Theft Auto. I remember, just as an example, Grand Theft Auto came out right after I joined EA in 2000. We all thought it was going to be Madden and the DVD-ROM drive that was going to make the PS2. It was Grand Theft Auto. This game, there was nothing like it before. There were a lot of games like it afterwards, but there's nothing like it before. It was also insanely fun to play. So, of course, we bored our friends talking about all our great experiences we had in Grand Theft Auto. But games like Minecraft, The Sims, Dungeon and Fighter, which is our game in China, you'd say the same thing about all these games. OK. But what does our industry do when they're making games, by and large? And by and large, I mean about 90% of the companies that I talk to that I might want to buy, especially in mobile. What are they doing? They're not in the upper right-hand corner there. They're making games that are slightly differentiated from everything else that's come out. So they'll say, hey, we're making a Clash of Clans clone, but unlike Clash of Clans, we're going to do it slightly differently. Or we're going to put this IP on top of the game. And why do they do that? Why would they make an undifferentiated game when they know, when you can point to anybody in the games industry and show them this chart, and 9.5 times out of 10 they'll agree with you on it? Well, they do it because they think it lowers risk. And they'll say it lowers risk. They'll say that's what we know works. And doing something different is way too risky for us. Or they say, well, just copy that because it's easier to do. What they're really doing is making a commodity. Think about this. When you make an undifferentiated product, it's a commodity. And they'll call it a lot of other things besides commodity, but that's really what they're making. By the way, they have a marketing problem, too. People gripe about the marketing costs on mobile all day long, but they may not have a marketing problem. They may have a product problem because they're selling an undifferentiated product. OK, but it gets actually worse than that because making a game, it turns out, is really hard. So you make a marginally fun, marginally differentiated game. So we know all the money and all the successes in the upper right-hand corner, but 90% of our industry, by our own anecdotal evidence, is in the lower left. So in M&A, we watch out for this really closely. We stay away from the companies that we think are going to be in the lower left. We look at whether they're trying to do, whether they aspire to do something different than what's already out there. And if they aspire to do something different, then we get really interested. And then we start asking tough questions about whether they can pull it off and move it into the upper right-hand quadrant. Because a lot of game companies that have great intentions, they're going to be in the lower right-hand corner. But that's still not where success is. You have to be good game makers to do this. And this takes a lot of iteration. OK, so those are my 4 mental models. They can help you think about games and help you think about the future. And just to recap, the first is about the ability to make a game life cycle much longer than what most people think. The second is about anticipating whether users will retain long before it shows up in the revenues. The third is about retention measurement over revenue measurement. And the fourth is about where hits come from when you're developing a new game. So used right, these mental models are going to give you a much clearer picture about whether a games in a company's portfolio are going to do well or not. And this will help you determine whether there's a valuation gap. And the good news for you is that the market, in our experience, frequently gets this wrong. OK, so with these in mind, you can start to understand why I'm so excited about Nexon. And I'll now describe Nexon to you briefly. Nexon is a company that in many respects, please excuse me torturing this analogy, but it feels sometimes like the 2002 Oakland A's. What we do doesn't look like what most people accept a great game company should look like or what a great company should do. These are our revenues. This is just quickly the background. We were founded in 1994. The green bars are our revenue lines. By the way, that far one, which is 2016, shows a blip down. That's merely due to currency. We report in Japanese yen, and about 90% of our revenue is outside Japan. So when the Japanese yen gets stronger, our reported numbers look weaker. But on a constant currency basis, you'd see the same up and to the right. Our biggest region is, well, this quarter it's China, but typically China is just a hair's breadth ahead of Korea. Our second biggest is Korea. Japan, which is where we're listed, is third, and North America and Europe, Southeast Asia make up the rest, although most of those are growing pretty well. We've made very consistent 30 to 40% operating margins, and as you can see, we've grown very consistently. But despite this huge and consistent growth, we're widely ignored, or oftentimes are. Our first game was Kingdom of the Winds. This was the first graphic online game in 1996 in Korea. We were also the first makers of free-to-play. And just very briefly, free-to-play games, we had a game that was a subscription game that was starting to decline. We decided, what the heck, we're private, we don't care. We'll give a gift to our users, we'll make it free. And the MAU numbers skyrocketed. And then we started selling little items as an experiment, haircuts and virtual tennis shoes and lollipops. This became really popular, and that was the birth of free-to-play. Most people don't know this about where free-to-play actually came from. That was a Nexon game called Quiz Quiz. It was not strategery in monetization. It was experimentation. And then it was a lot of iteration on what didn't work. And the point here is that iteration is where this knowledge comes from. It's something you have to get your hands very dirty with. Today we service over 60 games in over 100 countries. Our two largest games each month are Dungeon & Fighter and MapleStory. And the story of them is very important. Both are over 10 years old, and both continue to grow. This is almost unheard of in the games business. Dungeon Fighter today is either the first or the second largest game in China, and it's been somewhere in the top 3 for the last 7 years, either 1, 2, or 3. But I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But what makes Nexon truly special and misunderstood is that we're the #1 game company for making a game last and grow for a really, really long time. Our core specialty is creating very long-lasting and durable relationships between our tens of millions of customers and our games. And we think that this is one of the most powerful ideas in video games. It's been widely ignored in the video games industry. We've been doing it for over 2 decades, as you saw, and our capability to make this happen has been getting stronger in our core regions like Korea and China. And now we're taking it around the world to places like the US, as well as Japan and Southeast Asia, which have been growing quickly for us. This longevity in our existing games gives us a strong and stable base of cash flows to invest in new games. And our discipline in investing in ROI, positive marketing that I talked about before means we don't flush our cash flows down the toilet trying to drive up near-term revenues. And I'll take 3 brief examples from our portfolio. To my industry, these examples are sort of like the undervalued player who gets on base consistently, and in doing so wins baseball games, but they don't look like the typical monster hit. MapleStory is now 13, that's the one on the left. It's now 13 years old. During the IPO, which was 5 years ago, we just passed our 5-year anniversary of our IPO, the #1 question that I got when I was CFO was, when does MapleStory and Dungeon Fighter go down? Again, because people are thinking about that red curve that I showed you up front. They say, gee, MapleStory is kind of old. When's it going to go down? Today, MapleStory is as big as it was 5 years ago. I'm pretty sure nobody on our roadshow thought that that was going to happen. Dungeon Fighter is even more amazing. It's now 11 years old, and it's twice as big as it was 5 years ago. That's 8.7 as of last quarter. We just announced results on Friday, so I haven't updated our number. But as of last quarter, that's $8.7 billion life-to-date gross revenue. And to put that in some perspective, the largest movie franchise, not single movie, but total franchise of all time is, you can probably guess, Star Wars. Star Wars life-to-date box office, I'm ignoring lunch boxes and figurines for a second, and t-shirts, but just box office, which is sort of an apples to apples. Star Wars is $7.6 billion. So we're a quarter as old as Star Wars. Star Wars is 40 years old. Dungeon Fighter is 11. And we're $1 billion bigger. This gives you an idea of why I oftentimes say in my own industry, the party's over here. It's not down in Hollywood. We should stop our Hollywood envy. And then Dominations is a really good example of a newer game that's showing the same sort of pattern. We just reached our 100 million in lifetime revenue mark. It's showing the same kinds of stability that we like to see in our more mature franchises. So you can see why we think this idea of longevity is so powerful. And it's not just these games, it's many other games in our portfolio. Our business is really much more close to a software as a service model than it is to the traditional video games model. Okay, and as I said before, that feeds in our development and risk-taking of new games. I showed you Lawbreakers before, which we think innovates heavily in the first-person shooter market. Durango also launches in this year, and this is a completely new genre in mobile, a truly massively multiplayer game in which tens of thousands of live players survive by hunting and farming and fighting and cooperating. This is on a mobile device. The mobile devices are now powerful enough to support this sort of game with thousands of players in the same world at the same time. And we've got many more on the way. All told, we've got over 30 games in development, and we're taking the kinds of risks that are supported by our existing cash flow. So now briefly going back to our questions. The kinds of questions that enable you to determine whether a company has a bright future are the ones that reflect how a game company actually gets successful. They don't get successful by doing a formula, or by putting high-fidelity graphics first, or by doing a copycat strategy, or trying to be like a movie. They get successful by putting out games that are differentiated and find an audience at a reasonable price of acquisition, and then grow that audience for a very long time. So I would argue or recommend that your questions should be about that topic. I would suggest that those questions, that those mental models that I just explained to you would have led you to, and I hope some of you recognize some of these names, Blizzard, Minecraft, Supercell, Tencent, Riot, Valve, way ahead of other investors. Now, some of these were private, a couple of them were public, but these were some of the best performers the last 10 years. And they were widely ignored early on. Again, just to use an example of Riot, Riot in 2009, nobody in my industry was talking about them. They were talking about Facebook games and Facebook game companies, and this company is now a monster. It definitely would have led you to Nexon 3 years ago when we were trading at 800 yen a share. This is a lesson learned a decade and a half ago from baseball, and it seems really overdue in my industry. So now that I've taken a little too much time and I've made life a whole lot harder for my IR department, I think Hanjun and I are going to have a little Q&A. Thank you very much.
So great, great, Owen. Thanks for that. We'll do a brief fireside chat, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. But just in terms of the mental models that you shared today, I think definitely Nexon has been the gold standard of being able to do that in a PC. Mobile, I think we're starting to get some traction and building traction. How would you think about the difference between replicating that on PC side? What is it different from mobile, and where is Nexon alongside that?
Well, mobile I think is, let's see, we could take that from a lot of angles. Mobile I think is very interesting for two reasons. Number one, when people talk about mobile, they display the same sorts of thinking that I've described a lot in my presentation. You'll hear people say, that's not successful on mobile. And you say, well, why isn't that successful on mobile? And they'll say, because nobody's playing those sorts of games. And you go, well, why aren't they playing those sorts of games? It turns out nobody's making those sorts of games. They're making, in large part, up until now, pretty much casual, single-player games. And that's changing somewhat. But there's a lot of sort of hall of mirrors thinking that goes on in that. There are some important differences between mobile and PC. One is that a mobile device is with you at all times. Number two is the interface is a little more tricky. Glass is harder than a keyboard and mouse or than a controller. So you have to make adjustments for that. You also have to make adjustments to know that you're not always going to have a good internet connection when you're on a mobile device. If you're in a subway or an elevator or a bus, those things go in and out. But you can design around those. And I would argue if there's more experimentation on that, that we'd probably be a lot farther along. And there's one other important one is that you can download and play a mobile game very quickly. On PC, it's a little harder. It's a little more cumbersome. And so people will download a game and then get rid of it if they don't like it. So you have to get their interest very early on and keep it. So if you remember that flow diagram that I showed you with difficulty and so on. You need to catch them at the easy to learn part pretty quickly. It's not like a PC game or a console game where you've spent money for the DVD. You're going to be sort of dedicated for the first couple hours. If you don't capture them in the first 10 minutes, then it's not going to be very interesting.
Got it. And in terms of following up on that, where do you feel Nexon is in terms of its stage of readiness for PCs? Definitely, you guys are doing well.
Yeah.
For mobile.
Well, mobile is about a quarter of our business right now. It looks much more compressed this quarter because we had a big quarter in our PC business, but typically it's about a quarter to a third of our revenues. We think overall that will continue to go up, and it'll especially be a less important question as PC and mobile devices converge. We see a convergence over the next 2 to 3 years. Your mobile device is already essentially a workstation quality. It's got a very good GPU now, and it's got a very good networking layer. So we can render a fully functional world, live online world, much more than a single player game. And that wasn't possible even a couple years ago. So the kinds of games that we like to make are much more favored now in mobile than they were before. And where we're really seeing this happen is in mobile in Japan. Our Japan business has always been very small as a percentage of our total revenue because it's been PC focused. But now we can take that live game ops group and the things that we know from live game operations, we can apply it to the much bigger mobile market. And that's pretty descriptive. That's a key driver of why our revenues have started to look up in Japan. Sure.
This is a contention within the market, I would say. Now that mobile is maybe a $37 billion market, almost equisized to console and PC, we've seen MMORPG type games come from PC to mobile. So I think a good chunk of people would argue that maybe mobile game market is maybe maturing. But do you agree with that assessment?
Not at all. I think those types of questions really mislead people for what's going on. Just to give you a very brief analogy, we were talking about this at lunch, but when I grew up in the United States in the 80s, okay? And if anybody is of my same age and same country of origin, you remember the TV that we used to watch in those days? It was awful. I mean, it was like Chips and Fantasy Island and Gilligan's Island. These were awful TV shows that I'm embarrassed to even say that I ever watched on a Saturday night. And then, and it used to be, by the way, the business where, the industry went to die. Like if you were an actor and you were doing terribly, you'd go to TV. Today, all the interesting stuff is happening in TV. And the market is expanding. And why is that happening? It's because some great creators were able to figure out that in order to muscle into the TV market, they'd have to compete on quality. And they saw some early examples with things like Seinfeld in the 90s. And then now TV is revolutionized. So the market is getting a lot bigger. So I look at TV as a perfect example of all the things that you thought were true are not actually true. It just takes some innovation. And you can change the rules of the game in your direction when everybody is looking at something else. So now the big TV companies are Netflix and Amazon and all. Everybody knows this story really well today, but it's hard to remember. Nobody would have thought this was possible 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. So I think there's a real parallel to the games industry when we look at, well, hey, things are going to mobile or things are going away from mobile, and what are the trend lines? The trend lines actually don't give you much predictive power.
So if you and presumably a lot of the industry participants would agree that mobile still has a lot of room to grow, then does that potentially invite more competition? Or how do you think about the competitive landscape?
Well, again, I think when you think about competition, if you put out, the lesson of TV has been played out in microcosm in the games industry over and over. Competition, of course, is important in the near term, but in the long term, if we had a much better class of developers and a much better class of publishers and operators in our business, we'd have a much healthier game business. I know this from my own experience. If a great game comes out, I'm just going to play more games because I'm interested in the art form, and I'll not want to play solely that game. I'll want to play something else, and it brings gamers in. A lot of people became gamers because of some of those great games that we talked about, or that I showed before, like Civilization or Minecraft. And so great games beget a better industry, I think. And that's, over the long term, that's much more important than near-term competition.
Got it. With that, maybe we'll open it to the floor for questions. The mic's coming in the back.
You referred to Hollywood about 3 or 4 times. Hollywood get a movie wrong It used to go straight to video, it's dead, you write it off, it's gone. You seem to imply you've got a model where you believe in a game and you'll invest in it and invest in it to change it. But how do you cut off? How do you know where you're wrong?
Meaning if a game development doesn't work out well?
If it's not working out well, but you believe in it because it's met your criteria.
That's a great question. And let me just briefly describe the proper game development process. The wrong game development process, as I said, was to treat it like a Hollywood movie. And by the way, game industry people make this mistake all the time. They'll talk about producers. Well, producer's not like a Hollywood producer, they're a project manager. Producers in Hollywood are financiers. They'll talk about pre-production, big pre-production process, and then they'll make the game, and then there'll be post-production. Those are all linear entertainment Hollywood models. Game industry is very different. All the great games that I showed up here, it's try something. Plan a little bit, try it, code it, and then test it. Plan it, code it, test it. So they'll go through an iterative process. What I look at very closely, and some of the games that I showed you are very much reflected at, is, okay, do you have the core of an idea that's really interesting? And it might be the lowest pixelated graphics that there ever were. That doesn't matter. What matters is, are you having a fun time playing it? And then you got to add in a little bit more and then develop a character more deeply, add in a couple other characters. But what you're constantly doing is seeing what you're breaking as a function of adding in a character. You might make a really great character that's really powered up, but it'll break the game for the rest of the characters in the environment. Or you may make a virtual wall 2 feet higher, and it suddenly breaks 30 game systems. And so you have to do that in a very iterative way. So what we want to do, and we're doing this more as we get in it more and sort of refining our development processes, we're doing a lot of testing. Where game companies make a big mistake is they decide what a game looks like, and then they throw a lot of graphics, development costs, a lot of technology into it very early on, and it costs money to do that. If we don't think we have a good game on our hands, we cut it off there. If we're not sure, we'll bring it to a closed beta test, and we'll watch the numbers. So we'll look at a lot of data. If we're still sort of unsure, we might take it to another level of beta, fix some things, take it into another level of beta, and then we'll watch it from there. But remember, over the course of a lifetime of a game, sorry, I know you want, over the course of a lifetime of a game, let's say it's been out for 5 years, in the total lifetime, only a small portion will be that initial development. But over time, you're going to continue to develop, so the much larger portion will be post-development, or post-launch development. Yes?
Yeah, if I go back to your chart on the differentiation and the fun, you were saying how most developers are doing the commoditized products. Doesn't that mean that distribution becomes much more important? And platforms like WeChat or something give Tencent a much bigger edge. So how do you compete in a mobile world when the games are becoming more commoditized and there's a handful of companies that control the distribution?
Well, our central thesis is the answer to that is not really a marketing problem. At its core, it's a product problem. So if you're the undifferentiated product in a land of, or the differentiated product in a land of undifferentiated products, then you're going to have a real leg up. So if you're the Tesla in a world of gas guzzlers, in some ways the game will market itself, or it'll do a lot more of the heavy lifting of marketing. That's one of the reasons why we believe in differentiation so much. And this has been true on lots of platforms. I'll give you an example. Supercell is a company we really admire a lot on mobile. A lot of people were making Clash of Clans clones. If you've ever seen the game Clash of Clans, you talk to game developer after game developer, you say, what are you making? They'll say, well, it's kind of like Clash, but slightly different. Then, just over a year ago, Supercell comes out with something that's nothing like Clash of Clans. They came out with Clash Royale, which is a very different game. And so now there's a new line of Clash Royale clones. But the point is, you come out with a differentiated product, and it helps you find its audience. This has been true in the games industry for a long time. EA just did this, by the way, last Christmas when they launched Battlefield 1. Every first-person shooter that launched at Christmas was a near-future, sci-fi inspired game, and they came out with World War I. So you can even do this in very competitive, very established genres. Now that's on console, but it's true on mobile as well. That's our view. So we're trying to make things that are more differentiated and unlike what other game companies are doing.
Sorry, just curious. Why are you still with Nexon? Why couldn't you start your own company? And what makes you be with Nexon for the next 20 years, for example?
I think Nexon is the coolest company on the planet. I mean, really, I do. I tried to buy it for a decade. And I begged them to sell it to me, and they kept turning me down. And what I saw at that time was Nexon was everything the rest of the industry was trying to be. Now, most people didn't believe me on that. By the way, it wasn't just that Nexon turned me down. I got mostly laughed out of the room the first couple of years when I was at EA. They're like, you don't know what you're talking about, rookie. This is how games work. It's graphics fidelity. I don't mean to pick on EA, but in those days, that was what everybody in the industry thought. So, again, I really believe this. Nexon is the #1 game for making a game last and grow for a very long time. We employ thousands of people who know how to do this really well. It's exceptionally hard to do. They've been doing it for years, and now we're taking it around the world. I think that's the coolest game company on the planet. And impossible to rebuild.
One last question.
So for a game title or studio that tick all your boxes, how much would you be willing to pay for it? And what kind of valuation metrics would you be looking at?
For a game studio that what?
For a game studio that tick all your boxes of what you mentioned. Someone like a Supercell, for example. How much are you willing to pay for it? And compared to what Tencent paid for it, do you think they overpaid, underpaid, or paid just about right?
Well, it's hard for me to comment on what someone else does because every buyer is different, and I'm not inside Tencent, so I don't know what their calculation is. But one of the things a strategic buyer has to keep firmly in mind is where they think the game and the team is going to go from there, like from the time of acquisition. But valuation metrics are very much look-back metrics, obviously, by definition. So you really need to have a strong understanding of where the game is going from where it is today and what the management team is going to do. And if the management team is important, you got to make an assessment of whether the management team is going to stick around. Sometimes you buy a game company and you don't really care about the management team. You can run it without those people, but a lot of times you need that team. So retention is a big deal, and it's literally everything on the left-hand side of the balance sheet walks out the door every night. So it's very important. Those types of questions. So it's hard for me to answer your question about valuation metrics. There's some things that are outliers that don't make much sense to me. And I've also noticed that the private markets are oftentimes venture capital backed. And so a lot of the valuations, as I talked about, are based off of, or the perception is that they're based off of revenue growth, and I think that's very dangerous by itself. I've seen a lot of my ex-colleagues at EA who ended up in other companies get really burnt on that. Several of them lost their jobs by making that mistake, meaning they looked at fast revenue growth and then they bought the company and then they top-ticked it and then the next day it fell apart. I think really, I would go back to those 4 principles that I talked about before. That's really where I spend a lot of time thinking. And again, the good news is that this happens in public markets as well. Companies get misvalued all the time. Sorry, I hope that answers your question.
Great. Well, I think we've spent a good hour, so thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much. Thanks.